when you think of prophet, and you think of a prophet sent by God, you think of a person who was a great man. Who was a great man. Someone whom God directed and guided to bring humanity to his worship. Because this was the role of the prophets. But when you look at the prophets from the biblical perspective, you find something quite different. Quite different. The first story that caught my attention was in the book of Genesis, and it was the story of Noah, who was the first of the prophets mentioned in the Bible after the beginning, Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. Noah is depicted very similar as he is depicted in the Quran for most of the story. He's depicted as a man who lived for almost 1,000 years. He preached for almost 1,000 years. Very few people listened to him. So God decided to send the flood, and Noah built a boat in the middle of the desert. Very few people, they thought he was crazy, this, that, and the third. But there was another story depicted in Genesis about Noah that bothered me. It bothered me. And a lot of this is personal. I've heard from Christians say, you throw a lot of opinion around when you tell your story. And yes, because I'm telling my story. This is not an academic discussion. This is how I came to Islam. And now you're talking about a 16-year-old mind. That was 17 years ago. There's a story that Noah, after the flood, he realized somehow that if you take grapes and you ferment them, they become a very tingling, tangly, delicious drink that makes you feel very euphoric, which we know is khamr. So in reality, Noah in the Bible is depicted as the first person to partake in a khamr that is written, which is very, very odd. But there's a story that Noah became so intoxicated. Now I'm going to have to tell you something as well. I cannot tell you these stories verbatim. I cannot quote them. I'm paraphrasing. The reason I'm paraphrasing is for two reasons. Number one, we're in the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and some of this is not meant for the house of Allah. Number two, there are children in the room. And because of the fact that there are children in the room, and some of these stories are X-rated. Some of these stories are triple X-rated. Some of these stories should not have a rating L. So I have to find a way to word it in a way to get my point across to you without saying too much. There's a story that Noah's two sons came to look for him. And they found their father in his home, drunk, passed out on the floor naked. He had partied hard, apparently. He had one crazy night. And they were embarrassed by this, so much so that one of the sons took off his outer garment, laid it over his father, and they both ran away, so that they would not see their father's nakedness. Now, this bothered me for one particular reason. I did understand that it was a Christian concept, that God can use even sinful people for great purposes. I understood that concept. But when it came to prophets and messengers, I was under the opinion that there should be a different standard. Because it goes to the point of credibility. Credibility. Because here you have a man who is found in this condition, so intoxicated that somehow he took off all his clothes. Who knows what he was doing all night long, completely naked. But they found him on the floor in this condition. Now imagine if that same man were to get up, go out into the streets and say that God has sent me to tell you such and such and such and such. It goes to the issue of credibility. Hold on a second. Didn't I see you last night running around completely naked in the streets? And now you want to tell me that God says this and that and the third? You sure it wasn't your donkey speaking to you? Because when you're that intoxicated, you can come up with a lot of crazy ideas. It bothered me, but I didn't pay too much attention that time because it was one small story. One small story about Noah, who was way at the beginning of time. And maybe, there was completely different scenarios in the beginning of time. So I continued reading, and you get to the story of Lot, which is not very far after the story of Noah and Ibrahim, careful of how I tell it. And it's the story of Lot and his two daughters. Now, in the Quran, we also have the story of Lot and his daughters. Correct? But it's quite different. In the Quran, Lot is offering his daughters in a halal marriage to these men who are seeking to seek a means of marriage relationship that is outside the bounds of Islam. But the story of Lot and his two daughters from the Bible, completely different. The story is that Lot had two daughters, but he had no son. He had no son. And his daughters were very worried about this. Why? Why would they be concerned? Because he was an old man at this time. Why would they be concerned that their father might die without having a son? What's the problem with that?
Because they won't have children.
Huh?
Because they won't have children.
Not just that.
Because there's no man there.
There's no wali for them. After their father is gone, there is no wali for them. That means they could be harmed, they could be abused, they could be mistreated, and no one's going to stand up for them. They would basically be orphans. They would have no one to caretake for them. And they were quite worried about this, so they decided to fix the problem. How did they fix the problem? They didn't go get their father married or any of this. What they did was, the oldest daughter got her father intoxicated, and she laid with him so that she could have a child, and hopes there would be a son. And then the youngest daughter did the same thing the next night. And this is how they decided to fix this problem. Now, this would cause me a little bit more concern. Because, okay, maybe Lot is not a prophet, according to the Bible, but why would a story like this even be in the Bible? I can't begin to grasp what I'm supposed to learn from this story. What am I supposed to get out of this story? What is the take-home message from this story? This is a story you will not find preached in pulpits on Sunday at church. You won't find parents reading this story to their children before they put them to bed at night. This is a story that is one of those black stories that you never hear about. You'll hear about Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot, but they don't tell you this part of the story. Go and ask any preacher on Sunday, tell me the story of Lot and his two daughters. It's not what you're going to tell your congregation on Sunday. So I have a problem. And I'm being told, when I question these things, that Number one, this is a dangerous pursuit, is to question these type of things. One of the biggest things in Christianity is to question these types of ideas and things. Number two, I'm being told that these prophets and all of this were very bad in these stories to lead us to Jesus. Everything's about Jesus. Everything's going to take you to Jesus. You know, the reason Adam sinned, take you to Jesus. The reason Noah sinned, take you to Jesus. The reason Lot sinned, take you to Jesus. Because Jesus was the fulfillment of what we were not able to be able to do. That we can't be perfect, we can't live up to the law, we can't be pleasing to God, except unless God came and died for our sins. The reality is, the answer is yes. I kept reading. And in between I'm seeing so many things, but we're crunched on time. There were two stories that really, really bothered me, that caused me to have a crisis of faith. And these stories were the stories of Suleiman and Dawood, alayhi salam. The story of Solomon and the story of David. I'm going to tell you the story of Solomon first. And you'll find this in the book of Kings, 1 Kings and 2 Kings. Solomon was one of the prophets and the kings of Israel, one of the great kings of Israel. And Solomon was a follower of the law of Moses. He was supposed to be implementing the law of Moses on earth. This was his job, to implement the law given to Musa alayhi salam, and to be the guardian of the children of Israel. Now, within the law that was revealed to Musa alayhi salam, in the Bible, does anybody know what is the first law? What was the first law? The first commandment.
Hear Israel, the Lord our God is one.
Thou shalt have no other God with me. Don't make anything equal to me. Do not worship any graven images, nor anything that is in the heavens, nor on the earth. Worship me alone, basically. The initial commandment from God to Musa alayhi salam, worship none but Allah alone. Now, Solomon had many wives. It's reported to maybe up to 1,000 wives and concubines, which is that which your right hand possesses. Now, one of these wives was a mushrikah. She was an idolatress. And Solomon loved her very much. And through his affection with her, she and was able to convince him to begin worshiping idols. So Solomon, the prophet, the king of Israel, the upholder of the law of Moses, is breaking rule number 1. He himself begins to worship idols in the Bible. Not only does he himself begin to worship idols, but he builds temples. He builds temples to worship idols. So he erects temples, as he was a great architect. He erects temples so that other people can come and break the cardinal commandment, worship none but God alone. Now this is not only an issue with me, but it is a conundrum that cannot be answered. Because the children of Israel, the children of Israel, are commanded to worship God alone. And they are punished severely when they don't do that. They should have learned that throughout history. Whenever they broke this rule, when Musa left and they worshipped the calf, they were punished to wander in the wilderness, and etc., etc., etc. Also, the children of Israel were commanded to obey their prophet. They were commanded to obey their messenger. So now what do? Do they worship God alone and disobey Solomon? Or do they obey Solomon and disobey God and worship something other than him? And my question was, if someone followed Solomon in worshiping idols, could God hold them accountable for it? They could very easily say, look, the man you sent us was doing this, so we did it. So there's a big problem here. This makes a big conundrum that can't be answered except but Jesus fixed it. That's a realistic fact. That's what the answer you're going to get. That's why Jesus had to come. This doesn't answer about the people of Solomon. Oh, well, Jesus went to hell and he preached to those people too. Remember this. The next story is the story of David. And this actually is the most abhorrent story when it comes to people. The worst of those stories is Solomon. He broke the greatest command. We know that shirk is born of alim. This is the worst evil. But David does something that is treacherous. Treacherous. You all know who Dawood is, alayhi salam. David is attributed as well as being a prophet and a king. He's attributed to writing some of the Psalms in the Old Testament. We know he was given an actual book known as the Zabur. But there's another story about David, and it's about a woman named Bathsheba. There was a woman named Bathsheba, and she was very beautiful, extremely beautiful. And David saw her one day and decided that she was so beautiful that he had to have her. So he had her brought to him, and he had her. And again, you got to read between the lines there. He had her. But there was a problem with this. Does anybody know the problem? Anybody know this story? Bathsheba is married. And her husband's name is Uriah. And Uriah is a soldier in the army. So David has just committed what sin? Adultery. Now, according to the law of Moses, which David is supposed to be upholding, what is the punishment for the sin of adultery? Death by stoning. Death by stoning. So the prophet, the king of Israel, the upholder of the law, is now guilty of a sin which if he was to be found guilty for, he would be put to death. Now David realizes he has made a mistake. He's made a problem. So he decides to fix it. How does he fix it? He fixes it by calling Uriah to come back from the military. He calls Uriah back from the military. And the first thing he tells Uriah to do is to go be with your wife. Go be with your wife. Why? Anybody guess? If she became pregnant, it can be attributed to Uriah. You see, David was very intelligent as well as treacherous. So he says, go be with your wife and then come back to me. As Uriah is gone, David writes a letter to the army that when the battle is fierce, when you have a next battle, put Uriah on the front line, and when the battle becomes really fierce, everyone is to